Counter-Narrative News wanted to share some research about relations between China and Israel and its ramifications. This is informed by a quote that was shared by a colleague of ours. Many thank you, Alex. And the piece is entitled Engaging Israel in the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Techno-Nationalism in the Middle East, by two academics, one a Ziying Wu, who is based at the university in Hong Kong, and also a Richard Yarrow, who seems to be based in the Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge. Also, Ziying Wu seems to be associated with Boston University as well. They don't seem to be like total right-wingers, and it's an interesting paper which I'm going to share a quote from very shortly. But just going back to Mao Zedong and China, now Mao develops his Chinese road to socialism in his own independent way, in a counter-oppositional posture towards other global communist leaders, particularly Stalin, who has his own ideas and framework of what the Chinese Revolution should be, mainly emphasizing support for the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang, which then goes off after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, takes Taiwan as a breakaway republic and allies closely to US imperialism. Through the revolutionary processes in the 20s, 30s, going into the 40s, and the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949 by Mao Zedong and the communists, because they have this independent revolutionary path and framework and leadership and organization, they're able to also engage quite independently with other revolutionary movements and conceptualize that and develop their ideology around that. As Counter-Narrative News has been sharing the history and the research several times now, the framework of the anti-colonial socialist advocacy and leadership is resolved by the international communist movement and its veritable de facto leader, Vladimir Lenin, by 1920, actually in discussion at the Comintern with Bengal Indian-based revolutionary M.N. Roy, in which Lenin replaces support for quote-unquote bourgeois democratic national liberation movements against colonialism to just national liberation movements against colonialism, emphasizing that communists and those who believe in a true independence of nations vis-a-vis colonialism will support the more revolutionary elements in that nationalist struggle that's led by the more radical socialist forces of the workers and peasants and allied social and cultural classes. And that's very much what Mao continues as well, and you can see Mao engaging with other revolutionary forces. And it's important to note that in a global situation, either revolutionary forces kind of cross-fertilize and give solidarity and mutual support to each other and really build their capacity, or things fall apart. It's either one direction or another. Similarly, nationalism is either in one direction or another. It's a form of nationalism which is actually outlooking, it's internationalist, it's committed to global solidarity through rhetorical, political, ideological and material support. So that's one form of revolutionary nationalism. Or there's another form which Lenin was campaigning against, especially in the outbreak of the First World War, and which all revolutionaries kind of campaign against, which is sometimes called narrow nationalism or national chauvinism. Sometimes it's called big state or big nation arrogance or chauvinism or oppression. And so it's this kind of more narrowly sectarian nationalist posture which does not seek to make global alliances and unities, but actually looks out for its own state at the expense of other oppressed peoples and struggles. And so China was a revolutionary state in this regard until around the 1970s. And then there was the secret meeting with Kissinger, with Mao in 1971, the Nixon's visit in 1972, leading the Chinese leadership to take a much more narrower nationalist posture, breaking its relations that it had with the Pan-Africanists, for example, the Pan-Arabs and the Black Power movement, the famous case of Robert F. Williams, the Black Power leader who was allied with Malcolm X and the Revolutionary Action Movement and other revolutionary forces in the US, influencing Mao to make Mao make statements in support of black liberation in the early 60s as well. That all shifts, and then Mao takes China towards a more narrow nationalist path with his anxiety and competition around Big Brother next door in the Soviet Union, led by Khrushchev after Stalin. And then that alliance, the Sino-Soviet alliance, falls apart by the mid-60s. And then really towards the end of Mao and definitively by the next leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, allies very closely with US foreign policy in a strategy against the Soviet Union, which they considered was the number one quote-unquote imperialist power in the world. So Mao says in 1963, on August the 8th, he says, in the fight for complete liberation, the oppressed people rely first of all on their own struggle and then only then on international assistance. The people who have triumphed in their own revolution should help those struggling for liberation. This is our internationalist duty. So that's Mao in 1963. Mao on January the 12th in 1964 argues, quote, the people of the countries in the socialist camp should unite. The people of the countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America should unite, the people of all continents should unite, all peace-loving countries should unite, and all countries subjected to US aggression, control, intervention or bullying should unite and so form the broadest united front to oppose the US imperialist policies of aggression and war and to defend world peace, end of quote. So that's quite clear, but as was mentioned, this changes by the 70s. And now you have a situation where China's most closest ally in the Middle East is the white supremacist colonial state of Tel Aviv, i.e. Israel. So this is quite interesting. So going to this quote, and let's go to this quote, then we can have some discussion. So to quote the piece Engaging Israel in the Belt and Road Initiative by Ziying Wu and Richard Yarrow, quote, Israel's fundamental incentive for fostering ties with China can trace to a deeper need to protect against the unreliability or future anti-Semitism of Israel's traditional Western partners. To Israeli leaders, warm relations with China provide a range of benefits while aligning with Israel's fundamental strategic goals. Israel's prime threats come from its immediate neighborhood, Iran, Hamas and Hezbollah, and to a less extent support for anti-Jewish violence within the West Bank, Syria, Egypt and other states. Israeli officials recognized China's pragmatic stance towards Middle Eastern affairs and hoped China would eventually change its position on Iran and Palestine. Israel does not see China as a central competitor or risk, and Israeli security and intelligence officials have publicly and repeatedly dismissed US worries about China-Israel ties. With strong ties to China, Israeli officials potentially gain new levers for applying pressure on Iran or for obtaining information about potential Middle Eastern enemies, including anti-terrorism cooperation with Chinese authorities. Just pausing the quote there. So you can see with the Chinese brokered Saudi-Iran deal that Israeli leadership have expressed that they're totally comfortable and fine with that, and it's helpful actually, and US leading officials have said the same thing. So that kind of chimes with this quote here. And also Norman Finkelstein has said something very interesting in relation to Israel's support by the West. He said there was a time up to around the late 50s that the West did not support Israel strategically, and then it did, particularly after the 1967 war. And Norman Finkelstein argues there will come a time again where Israel will feel increasingly negative and anxious about its junior relationship to its senior partners in London and especially Washington, and that might shift again. And you can see with Netanyahu's far-right kind of lurch and all the crisis that brings with that there's actually a demonstration as we speak in Israel against the United States, for which they consider Biden's comments suggesting that Netanyahu would stop his processes leading to such crisis. And big sections of Israeli society are very upset at that, and they may see the much more uncritical Chinese and Russian partnership as being more favorable. And you can see this all in play right now. Back to this academic text to quote, a key goal of Israeli leaders over the last 20 years has been to foster alternative allies which can counterbalance potential risk from Israel's traditional Western allies. Such new allies could help to make Israel quote-unquote normal and accepted on the global stage, a dream of Zionist thinkers and political leaders since long before Israel's establishment as a state. Israeli leaders have engaged in acrobatics to build alliances with parties that flirt with anti-Semitism in Hungary and Poland and which can veto anti-Israel policies within the EU. Netanyahu welcomed warmer relations with Vladimir Putin in Russia and Narendra Modi in India. These conservative and authoritarian-inclined leaders provoke little sympathy amongst most Israelis, but Russia and India both potentially offer Israel additional geopolitical security, and the prospect of Israeli alignment with either Russia or India could help dissuade Western countries from seeking to pressure Israel too strongly. China today performs a similar function. By fostering closer ties to China, Israel might add an extra avenue for protecting itself, gain an ally that might insist that Israel be treated as a normal state, and leave an implicit warning for Western countries hoping to force Israel into adopting policies that Israelis see as existentially threatening. Thus, in addition to economic benefits, the Belt Road Initiative might offer Israelis an opportunity for a more secure and more globally affirmed normality of their nation. End of quote. So things are really clear there, and what this paper reflects is the realities of the political relationships, where China and Russia are not vested in the region for the unity of the Arabs and their independence, and for easing the growing burden of exploitation and oppression against the increasingly divided and vanquished Arab peoples. This should be very, very clear, but it's indicative of how the landscape has profoundly shifted towards the right and the far right, in that there's hardly anyone making these critical comments. So that's really important, that ourselves in counter-narrative news and those who we're engaged with and our audiences are really kind of engaging with these issues in a serious and sober and unprejudiced manner that is not expressing the toxic, totally skewed perceptions of being in any quote-unquote camp. Many thanks.